Reboots, adaptations, and retellings have been going wild for decades. Everything from Sherlock to Jurassic World to World War Z. We love to take a story and change it into something new. But that can be tricky. How do you put a new spin on the source material while also being respectful to it? Let's find out. First, let's define these different kinds of storytelling so we're on the same page. And let's start with retellings. These come in a wide range of faithfulness to their source material. They can be a literal retelling of the original story, like Neil Gaiman's book, Norse Mythology, or the author can make drastic changes to the original story, like Hamlet and The Lion King. There are parallels, and even the writers of The Lion King have said that it draws a lot of inspiration from Hamlet, but the two stories have major differences, like how one is about lions and the other is people, as well as some plot stuff, but mainly the lions. The key here is that it is still essentially the same story. Next, let's define a reboot. These are extensions of stories that were previously complete. Reboots get a lot of flack these days, mostly due to overexposure if I had to guess. Hollywood has been going reboot crazy for a while now, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we'll get to that later. And finally, we have adaptations. This is when you take a story and tell it using a different medium. For the sake of this video, when I say adaptation, that means a writer's best attempt at a one-for-one remake. Is the 1996 Romeo and Juliet film an adaptation or a retelling? It's both. We've changed the medium, and we've changed aspects of the story.
Do you buy your thumb in us, sir?
I do buy my thumb, sir!
Do you buy your thumb in us? Sir.
Is law of our side if I say aye?
No!
No, sir, I do not buy my thumb at you, sir, but I buy my thumb, sir!
I wanted to make this distinction because you could argue that adaptations are retellings. Since you will always have to change details to fit the new medium, you might be able to do 100% play to movie adaptation, but when you get into the other mediums, it starts to get really hazy, but we'll get to that in a bit. I will also occasionally refer to all of these as retellings, so I don't have to say retellings, adaptations, reboots over and over again. R-A-R. RAR. Never mind, I'm calling them RARs. The first reason to write and develop a retelling adaptation, a RAR, as far as Hollywood is concerned, is that they're great for marketing. They are kind of like gimmicks like we talked about in our last video. They stick out from the crowd, and their characters are immediately recognizable and easier to get on board with. It takes less work to make the audience understand Sherlock Holmes' character in each adaptation because the audience already knows who he is for the most part. People are also attracted to familiar characters. Say you're picking at a book or going to the theater. You could take a risk on a standalone book or movie, or you could choose the option that's related to something you've enjoyed before. Statistically, people are more likely to take the safe choice there. There are reasons other than marketing to write a RAR though. RARs can be good for making new commentary on the original work. You can see this in parodies, which often exaggerate aspects of the original story in an effort to be funny, but also make a commentary on issues within the source material. Although, I think the most attractive thing about RARs, at least for a hobbyist writer like me, is that they're a ton of fun to write. I've even heard it suggested that new writers should write fan fiction, which is a type of RAR, in order to get their sea legs. Having pre-built characters and settings are great training wheels when you're learning how to craft a story. But also, it's just good fun to take something old and beloved and turn it on its head. You might want to borrow small details from something else to make a reference and in turn send a message about your plot. Wicked, the Broadway musical, does this superbly by taking The Wizard of Oz and telling a new story from the perspective of Elphaba, the Wicked Witch. But I don't have to tell you how much fun it is to write a RAR. You clicked this video, so obviously you have some kind of interest in it. But I am curious, what's the best RAR you've ever seen or read? Let me know in a comment down below. Now, let's get into the big question. My Like I said before, there's a lot of paths you can take when writing a RAR, so let's explore the possibilities. As far as I can tell, there are 4 big categories that RARs fall under: substitution, perspective switch, inspired retelling, and reboots. Let's start with substitution. The key here is that you generally follow the same characters and similar story, but with a twist. This is what they do in the 1996 Romeo and Juliet movie I mentioned earlier. They asked, what if we made a movie of Romeo and Juliet, but instead of the original setting, we place it in the modern United States, and the Montagues and the Capulets are crime families. Same goes for the BBC Sherlock, which mostly takes place in modern London, as opposed to recreating the Victorian era in which the originals were written. The second big type is the perspective switch. You take a story, and instead of following the original main character, you follow someone else to show a different aspect of the story. Some popular examples would be the aforementioned Wicked or John Milton's epic poem Paradise Lost, which takes a look at the war in heaven described in the Bible and not only expands it, but also chooses Lucifer as its point of view character. Or you could look at Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which is a retelling of the events of Hamlet, but from the perspective of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Hamlet's childhood friends. And just to demonstrate how the different types of RARs can play together, remember when I mentioned Hamlet and The Lion King earlier? Have you ever heard of Lion King 1.5? If you haven't, it's a direct-to-video sequel to The Lion King, which follows the events from the first movie from the perspective of Timon and Pumbaa, who are ostensibly the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern characters. Lion King 1.5 is essentially Timon and Pumbaa Are Dead as a Mystery Science Theater 3,000 pastiche to boot. An inspired retelling is when your RAR is simply based on another story. You could argue that this is essentially just substitution pushed to the nth degree, but didn't feel right to lump them together since they can feel so different. I think the best example of these are Marvel's forays into Norse mythology with the Thor films. The series mostly cherry picks aspects of the original mythology to supplement Thor's story instead of adapting or actually retelling the original stories. Game of Thrones also fits into this category since it was based on the English War of Roses. You can actually decently track the historical war between the Lancasters and the Yorks through their fictional analogs, the Lannisters and Starks. Of course, the dragons and resurrections muddy things a bit, but we'll give it a pass because dragons. Everything's better with dragons.
Do you bite your thumb at us, sir?
I do bite my thumb, sir!
Inspired retellings like these often borrow pieces from the original story to make structure for something entirely new. The War of Roses was just a starting place for Martin, and if you know a lot about English history, it's not gonna spoil Game of Thrones, and the same goes for the Thor movies and Norse mythology. The final approach to a RAR is the reboot, which we mentioned in a previous section, but these are a little bit different from the other types of RARs, since they aren't trying to strictly retell a story. Instead, they seek to expand on the source material. We can see an example of this in The Legend of Korra, which rebooted Avatar: The Last Airbender. The sequel series takes place after Aang's death, and the world has changed a great deal from what audiences saw in the original show. But there are plenty of things that didn't. The writers reminded us of the show's roots by showing us characters from Avatar who we loved, or their children, and what became of them. So there are 4 major approaches you can take. Remember though, there aren't clear lines between them. These are just frameworks to think about when you approach a RAR. Understanding what you are trying to accomplish can help you choose the path you want to take. Are you trying to make a commentary on the original work? A perspective switch is great for that. Are you just trying to play around in a world you love? Reboot may be the way to go. But there are plenty of reasons to not write a RAR. Remember that we're working with known source material, so we need to be aware of how our story meshes with what came before. Like I said, there are some very clear and present dangers of writing a RAR, and I think one of the biggest ones is the trap of doing something that's been done before. Like, do we need live-action remakes of old Disney movies?
Oh, what we do? I wanna be like you.
The couple I've watched have just made me want to watch the originals.
Oh, ooby-doo. I wanna be like you.
Obviously, the perspective switch is an effective way to distinguish from the source material, but the rest of the paths can toe the line of being original enough to be worth it. Even reboots can suffer from this, as we learned with Star Wars Episode 7. While it's a fine movie on the surface, it's just a weak rehash of A New Hope at its core. I remember a lot of people being fine with that, but not particularly excited about it either. For some, the film felt like Star Wars was going back to its roots. For others, it felt like the story was phoned in. I can't really tell you how to write a RAR that's super original. It'll change depending on your story and the source material. But generally, I think you should push things as far as you want, at least in the rough draft. I'm not saying you should deliberately change so much that you betray the source material, but anything can be fixed in the edit. If you push things too far, you can always pull it back. Going at a first draft with a conservative mind frame, though, can keep you in a box and stop you from finding the thing that sets your RAR apart from the original story. As far as I'm concerned, though, originality isn't a huge issue. I enjoyed Star Wars Episode 7, even if it wasn't super original. But Star Wars Episode 9, though? Not a huge fan. But that's because I felt like it betrayed the source material by expanding the world beyond rules set in the original movies, which I'm not saying you can't do. You can, and it can work great. But this does hint at another big roadblock for writing a RAR: audience expectation. The audience will have expectations of how the source material should be treated, and this roadblock stands at odds with originality. Push things too far and the audience you want to reach may reject your attempt. Don't push far enough and you may risk making something bland and forgettable. It's hard to nail down a single rule about how to do this well, since it will change depending on the source material. But you need to be as in tune with audience expectations as possible, which may mean talking to some other fans to see what they expect. So let's look at some examples and explore where they do or don't find that balance. And don't worry, I'm done talking about Star Wars. I know a trap when I see one.
It's a trap!
First, let's focus specifically on audience expectations. Godzilla has a long history. The franchise started in 1954, stretches 36 movies, and has seen multiple eras and reboots. So if you were going to reboot Godzilla, what would your audience expect? Godzilla's inception, Gojira, isn't the big lizard destroy kind of movie that the franchise is famous for. It's a serious and terrifying commentary on the power man wields and weapons of mass destruction. Godzilla is the result of nuclear testing, and the plot hinges around the use of a weapon so dangerous that its creator sacrifices his life to keep anyone else from using it ever again. Gojira is beloved. It is a staple of Japanese cinema and stands as one of the best movies on atomic power ever made. But there is a second camp when it comes to Godzilla expectations.
Big lizard smash.
The Godzilla franchise quickly morphed into campy kaiju mania after the first movie. New monster after new monster show up and fight Godzilla and company. While these movies often attempt to have serious subject matter, what shines are the silly plots and action. These movies are fun. So what do people expect from a Godzilla movie? Well, there are two schools of thought here since the series diverges so dramatically. Let's look at two recent reboots of the franchise and see how they hold up against expectations. First, Shin Godzilla from 2016. This movie seeks to recapture a similar energy as the first movie, but with a new twist. Instead of making commentary on the danger of nuclear weapons, this movie opts to comment on the inefficiency of bureaucracy. As Godzilla attacks, councils and administrators debate how to respond, but repeatedly they are incapable of taking any meaningful action. This movie recaptures the same energy as the first movie, but recontextualizes it for modern audiences. It's intense, eye-catching, and makes relevant commentary while paying homage to the original. In my opinion, it's one of the best Godzilla movies. or just movies in general. It's great, it's really good. This movie is fantastic and you should watch it. Now compare this to the 2014 Godzilla movie, and to preface this, I like the film, but I don't think it knows what it means to be a Godzilla movie. Like I said, there are two camps of Godzilla, serious allegory or big lizard smash. And this movie tries to be both. The plot is played super serious, which is fine, but there isn't any point to the tension they build. There's no message. They're just building up to the big monster action sequences, which are cool, but they're short-lived and not super fun. Godzilla is an interesting example here, because not all franchises will have these diverging paths of expectations, but it does highlight an important point. If you're going to reboot or adapt something, you need to understand what people love about it. While the 2014 Godzilla is not a bad movie by any means, it misunderstands the franchise. It saw the serious tone from early on and the big, silly monster fights from later in the series and decided to combine them. And while they made a good movie, they didn't make a good Godzilla movie. Now, let's look at the recent Thor movies from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Like I said before, these are an inspired retelling of Norse mythology, which means you can expect them to change a lot. And some of those changes work great, while some are just kind of confusing. In the first movie, you can find plenty of changes just in the first act. In the film, Odin loses his eye in combat, and while he does lose his eye in the original Norse story, in that version, Odin offers it in exchange for wisdom, not from a fight. Also, Thor's hammer Mjolnir is shown to be some kind of family heirloom, while in the original story, the hammer is a result of classic Loki antics. Are either of those gonna bother the average audience member? Probably not, but they did bother me. As a rule, don't change something that doesn't need to be changed. They didn't have to show how Odin lost his eye in the movie. He could have just worn the eye patch. The change felt meaningless and pulled me out of the movie. Compare that to Thor Ragnarok's characters Hela and Fenris. These are based on Hel and Fenrir from the original stories. Hel and Fenrir are actually children of Loki and his ice giant wife, Angrboda. Angrabua? In the movie though, Hela is Odin's daughter, and Fenris is her, cool wolf, I guess? And Loki has no significant other or children. Angrboda isn't even a character. These changes make a lot of sense in the context of the movie. It would have taken a lot of extra time to set up those details in the first act, and time is precious for movies. They don't want to waste it on exposition if they don't have to. Changing the nature of Hel and Fenrir is a small price to pay for saving screen time. The important distinction is that the changes I mentioned from the first movie don't feel like they were necessary, while the changes made in Ragnarok make perfect sense in the context of the movie. Loki's kid, Odin's kid, it doesn't matter. Hela and Fenris are still gonna destroy Asgard. Let's get to that and not waste time on lineage. But really, while I think Thor is a great place to look at how changing details can be strange and pull people out of the story, it excels in originality, especially Thor Ragnarok's take on the original Norse story. It has the space to do so because most people don't have expectations for Thor. At least in the United States, I was never formally taught the Norse pantheon. Most people don't know the stories, so they won't be bothered by the changes made. Low expectations make the space for high originality. These next two roadblocks are kind of specifically for adaptations since they focus on the dangers of changing mediums. This can be a difficult feat, especially when going from a book to movie, which tends to be the direction for a lot of adaptations. We've all heard the classic, "the book was better," and I don't think there's a good way to circumvent that phenomenon. Books are a more personal experience than watching a movie. You experience them through your own imagination. You spend a lot of personal time with them versus the short group experience of watching a movie. Books tend to be more precious in the eyes of the reader. There are ways to help stem the bleeding though, and the first is story scope. If you are going to adapt something, you need to make sure that the story is compatible with the scope of the new medium. A giant epic fantasy novel is going to be really hard to fit into a single movie, and there are plenty of examples we can look at here. For example, The Last Airbender. While this movie is horrible for plenty of reasons, it was doomed from the start. It's a fool's errand to fit a season of television into a single movie, no matter what good intentions Shyamalan might have had. You'd be condensing roughly 8 hours of television into an hour-and-a-half long movie. It'd be nearly impossible to do well and live up to expectations from the fans. In the other direction, you could look at the Hobbit trilogy. While these movies are much better than The Last Airbender, they pale in comparison to the Lord of the Rings movies and the source material. The Hobbit isn't a horribly long book at less than 100,000 words. It didn't need 3 movies. Each Lord of the Rings book was longer than The Hobbit, and yet each got only a single film. Expanding The Hobbit to 3 movies required the inclusion of filler, unnecessary backstory from the Silmarillion, and extra textual details, which breaks the rule we talked about earlier. Don't change stuff if you don't have to. They didn't have to add to the source material, but they chose to anyway to stretch the story out. You see fewer issues with scope when you look at theater to movie adaptations. While it isn't necessarily a one-to-one transfer, the two mediums tend to have similar scopes because they have similar lengths. To give a surface level analysis of scope, here are some general tendencies. A short to medium book can be a movie. A long book can be a miniseries. A book series can be a television show, and a play can be a movie. Now, that's all subjective, but it's a place to start. Remember, there are no rules, but the key is to be aware of the size of the story and how that translates to the other medium. You don't want to cut a bunch of stuff to shrink the story down, but you also don't want to add a bunch of filler you don't need to stretch it out. Basically, don't force something if the scope isn't working for your medium. Another thing to consider with adaptations is, will this story translate to the new medium? Mediums have a huge impact on the story, and some stories just won't translate. A Bruce Lee movie wouldn't make for a great audiobook. Action-heavy stuff doesn't lend itself well to a non-visual platform. Those movies wouldn't make great books, since action isn't the written word strong suit. Graphic novel or play though, I could see that. Let's look at the opposite of that with Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I actually like this movie, but that's probably from nostalgia since I watched it pretty young. Plus it gave us the songification of So Long and Thanks for All the Fish.
So long and thanks for all the fish. So sad that it should come to this.
But the movie is generally regarded as a swing and a miss. It just doesn't stand up to the source material in any meaningful way. It has a similar plot and retains some famous scenes, but it lacks a spark the book has. While the plot and characters in the novel are silly and memorable, they're not what makes the book great. Douglas Adams is. His unique writing style is hilarious and at times awe-inspiring when he uses science to evoke wonder, but most of his style is incredibly cerebral. If you attempted to make the movie anything close to the book, it would essentially have to be Mystery Science Theater 3000 with Douglas Adams in the front row. But even then, it likely wouldn't capture the same magic. While action doesn't easily translate to a non-visual medium, something as cerebral as Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy doesn't easily translate to a visual medium. But remember, these are just tendencies. Like everything in this video, they are not law. We've covered a ton of ground here, but when you are writing a retelling, adaptation, or reboot, here are some of the key concepts to consider. Why are you writing a RAR? Are you making a commentary on the text? Are you trying to take a fun new spin on the original story? These questions may affect which path you choose to tackle the story. And the path you choose when writing a RAR has a huge effect on the story. Ask yourself, are you doing a strict retelling? Or are you attempting to reboot a franchise? Or are you just borrowing some details? The answer to those questions will help you know what to look out for. But the most important thing, no matter what path you choose, is to always keep the source material in the forefront of your mind. What do people like about it? Will I betray people's expectations? Am I doing enough to separate myself from the source material? The answers to all of these questions will vary wildly depending on the source material, the community surrounding it, and your intentions. But remember, as always, there are no rules. Write what you want and have fun. Thanks for watching. Hey, make sure you like and subscribe and share this video if you enjoyed it. It helps out the channel a ton. Make sure you check out the live streams we started doing on this channel. We do them every other Monday, so that's twice a month. They're a ton of fun, so I'd love to see you there. Also, don't forget to check out Campfire Blaze. It is an all-in-one tool for writers. If you're subscribed to this channel, then I'm sure you have to have checked it out by now. It is free to use. There's a link down below. Check it out. Thanks again for watching. You're the best.